I've always believed that the natural world holds more wonders than we could catalog in a lifetime. That's what brought me to the dense backwoods of Arkansas, my field journal, camera, and an insatiable curiosity. I'd spent years documenting overlooked ecosystems across the country. But something about the murky swamplands surrounding Boggy Creek called to me. Perhaps it was the unusual biodiversity, or maybe the isolation that promised undisturbed specimens. Looking back, I should have heeded the warnings etched into the tired faces of folks locals. "You heading out there alone?" the gas station attendant had asked that morning, eyeing my hiking gear with obvious concern. "Just for the day," I'd replied, filling my canteen. "I'm cataloging native plants and wildlife." The man's weathered face had creased further. "Folks don't go out there solo, especially not this time of year." When I asked why, he'd simply shaken his head. Some things in those woods don't take kindly to being cataloged. I'd dismissed his concern as small-town superstition, the kind of local folklore that clings to any sufficiently remote area. After all, I was a scientist, devoted to observation and documentation. My graduate advisor would have scoffed at the very notion of letting backwoods myths interfere with fieldwork. So I'd smiled politely, paid for my supplies, and headed for the trailhead with the man's warning fading with each step into the wilderness. For the first few hours, the expedition had been remarkably productive. I'd photographed 3 varieties of orchids that shouldn't have been thriving this far north, collected samples of an unusual moss growing in perfect circular patterns, and spotted bird species typically not seen until later in the migration season. My journal filled with notes and sketches, each observation more intriguing than the last. The forest seemed almost deliberately diverse, as if something had cultivated this biological abundance. I'd been so engrossed in my work that I hadn't noticed the shifting daylight until shadows began to stretch like elongated fingers across the forest floor. Checking my GPS, I realized I'd wandered far off any marked trail. The device struggled to pinpoint my location, the signal weakening under the dense canopy. Still, I wasn't concerned. Not yet. I'd navigated out of trickier situations before. But as dusk settled over the woods, something changed. The forest, which had buzzed with life all day, fell unnaturally silent. No birds called, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving the cypress trees eerily still. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to any species in my field guides. A howl, deep and resonant, somewhere between a wolf's call and a man's scream, but somehow fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin prickled, the hair on my arms standing on end as ancient instinct screamed a single command: run. And run I did, crashing through undergrowth, my boots splashing through shallow water and mud. I abandoned all pretense of scientific detachment. The howl came again, closer this time, and with it the distinct sound of something large moving through the forest behind me. Not with the clumsy thrashing of my own panic-stricken flight, but with the deliberate, practiced movements of a predator that knew these woods far better than I did. My mind raced as fast as my legs, piecing together fragments of stories I dismissed. Local disappearances attributed to bog accidents or disorientation, hunters who refused to enter certain areas even in groups, blurry photographs published in tabloids that I'd laughed at over coffee with colleagues. The stories always mentioned the creature's howl first, the warning that came before the footprints, before the glimpses of matted hair, before people vanished without a trace. The folk monster, the Boggy Creek beast. I'd considered it nothing more than an amalgamation of bear sightings and overactive imaginations. Now, with night falling and that impossible howl trailing behind me, scientific skepticism seemed like a luxury I could no longer afford. I had no idea if I was running toward the road or deeper into the wilderness. The GPS had stopped functioning entirely, the screen flashing with distortion before going dark. The forest had become a maze of identical-looking cypress, trunks, and shadowy vegetation. My lungs burned with each gasping breath, the humid air thick and resistant. Another howl, so close now that it seemed to vibrate through my chest cavity. With it came a fetid smell, like wet fur and stagnant water and something rotten underneath. I stumbled over an exposed root and nearly fell, catching myself against a tree trunk. My palms came away sticky with some kind of resin that smelled unnervingly like copper. Blood? No, my rational mind insisted. Just sap catching the fading light. I remembered the stories then, told in hushed voices by locals at the diner where I'd eaten breakfast earlier that week. How the Miller boy had gone missing 30 years ago while fishing. His boat found intact, but empty, except for deep scratches along one side. How the Hendersons' hunting dogs refused to cross Boggy Creek, whining and pulling at their leashes, even as their masters dragged them forward. How sometimes, on particularly still nights, people on the outskirts of Folk would lock their doors against howls that seemed to carry human words within them. The creature called again, and this time I detected something almost conversational in its tone. A modulation that suggested intelligence behind the bestial sound. Was it speaking? Calling to others of its kind? The thought of being surrounded sent a new surge of adrenaline through my exhausted body. But fear alone couldn't sustain me forever. After what felt like hours of blind flight, my muscles began to fail. Each stride became shorter, each breath more painful. I couldn't maintain this pace. Not in the near total darkness that had descended. I needed to hide, to rest, to think. Ahead, I spotted a dense thicket of blackberry bushes and young pines growing in a tight cluster. Perfect. The thorns would discourage casual investigation, and the configuration created a small hollow at the center. I dove into the space, ignoring the scratches of thorns across my face and hands. Curling into a tight ball, I tried to quiet my breathing, to become as small and silent as possible. From my hiding place, I strained to hear any sign of pursuit. At first, there was nothing but the thundering of my own heart. Then came the sounds, not of crashing pursuit, but of something moving with methodical precision through the underbrush, sniffing, pausing, listening. The creature was tracking me, following my scent with predatory patience. Heavy footfalls approached my thicket, each step deliberate. Through gaps in the foliage, I could make out a massive shape moving on two legs, its outline blacker than the surrounding night. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung almost to its knees. And the hair, thick, matted hair covering its entire body, visible even in the darkness as a textural difference against the night sky. It stopped mere yards from my hiding place, its breathing audible now, deep, wet inhalations that seemed to taste the air. I pressed a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to whimper. Scientific curiosity warred with primal terror, as I realized I was observing something undocumented by modern biology. A creature that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. The Fauk monster turned its head slowly, surveying the area. Though I couldn't make out its features clearly, I sensed it was facing directly toward my thicket. Did it know? Was it toying with me? I couldn't tell, but I remained motionless, scarcely daring to breathe. Minutes stretched like hours as we remained in this terrible standoff. The creature standing silent and vigilant, me huddled in increasingly uncomfortable stillness. My leg had begun to cramp, pins and needles shooting through my calf where I'd been kneeling too long on the uneven ground. Just as I thought the creature might move on, disaster struck. The cramping intensified, sending an involuntary twitch through my leg. My boot shifted, snapping a small twig buried in the leaf litter. The sound was tiny, barely audible to my own ears. But in the silence of the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature's head snapped toward the sound with inhuman speed. A growl emanated from its chest, low and rumbling at first, then building to a snarl that displayed a predator's certainty. It had found me. I exploded from the thicket, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Pure survival instinct propelled me forward as I heard the creature crash through the bushes behind me. Its footfalls shook the ground, gaining on me with each stride. I zigzagged between trees, ducked under low branches, anything to slow the pursuit. But I was tired, so tired, and the monster knew these woods intimately. I could hear its breathing close behind me now, smell its musky odor. My foot caught in a tangle of exposed roots, and I stumbled, nearly falling. In that moment of imbalance, I felt something grasp the back of my shirt. Not claws as I'd expected, but something closer to fingers, strong and deliberate. The fabric tightened across my chest as I was jerked backward, my feet leaving the ground. My last thought wasn't of science or discovery, or even fear. Just a simple, clear realization. The stories were true. All of them. And now, I would become just another cautionary tale whispered by folk locals. Another reason not to venture alone into the woods surrounding Boggy Creek. I still remember the sound they made, like thousands of skeletal fingers tapping across a wooden floor. It's a sound I'll never forget, the harbinger of what would become the end of our town, our neighbors, and eventually, my family. It started with Old Man Peterson at the edge of town. Everyone thought he was just a crazy old coot when he called the local station, claiming he'd seen a centipede big as a house cat, dragging away one of his chickens. 3 days later, we all wished we'd listened. I was in the garage fixing our lawnmower when I heard my wife, Sandra, scream from the backyard. I grabbed the first weapon I could find, a shovel, and ran outside. That's when I saw it. The thing was enormous, at least 2 feet long, with pincers that gleamed in the sunlight. Our dog, Max, was already gone, the creature's mandibles buried deep in his neck. I swung the shovel with everything I had, connecting with what I thought was its head. The monster barely flinched. It released Max's limp body and turned toward us, rearing up on its back segments. I grabbed Sandra's hand, and we ran, slamming the door behind us as the thing scuttled after us. "What the hell was that?" Sandra gasped, her face pale with shock. "I don't know," I said, though deep down, I knew exactly what it was. The beginning of something terrible. That night, the local news reported similar sightings across town. The next morning came reports of the first human casualty. A jogger found on the trail near the woods, his body drained and withered. Hours later, they were everywhere. Streaming from the forest like a living tide, their segments glinting in the sun. "We need to get to the basement," I told Sandra and our kids, Emma and Jacob. Now. I'd always been a bit of a survivalist, something Sandra teased me about. Our basement was stocked with camping gear, a water purifier, emergency food. I'd never been so glad to be overprepared. I constructed a makeshift bathroom in one corner, while the kids hauled down blankets and pillows. "We just need to wait it out," I told them, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "The government will send help." Days passed. We could hear them overhead, mandibles scraping against the floor, searching. I modified a cattle prod from the garage, the only weapon that seemed to have any effect. The electrical current didn't kill them, but it made them recoil long enough to escape. On the third night, the power went out. We sat in darkness, listening to the battery-powered radio. The broadcaster described scenes that haunted my dreams. The hospital overrun, an entire nursing home. 43 residents gone in hours. The centipedes seemed drawn to the weakest. "What happens if they find a way down here?" Emma asked, her voice small in the darkness. "They won't," I promised, though I'd seen how they could flatten their bodies, squeeze through the smallest gaps. That night, I reinforced the door with everything I could find. Furniture, tools, boxes of holiday decorations we'd never use again. We learned their patterns. They were most active at dawn and dusk, quieter during the hottest part of the day. I watched through a crack in the boarded-up window as 3 of them coordinated to take down a deer. One drove it forward, while the others waited in ambush. They were intelligent. That terrified me more than anything. On the 5th day, Emma developed a fever. We'd run out of children's Tylenol. "I'll go," Sandra insisted when I reached for the prod. "I'm faster." I should have stopped her. That's what haunts me most. I should have insisted, but Sandra was stubborn, always the brave one. She made it to the bathroom cabinet and back to the basement door before it happened. A massive specimen dropped from the ceiling. She jabbed with the prod, making it writhe, but not before one pincer grazed her arm. "I'm fine," she said, clutching the medicine box. But within an hour, her arm had swollen to twice its normal size. Angry red streaks running toward her heart. By nightfall, she was delirious. "It burns, David," she whispered, her eyes unfocused, like ice and fire at once. I held her through the night, whispering promises I couldn't keep, telling her she would be fine. By morning, she was gone. 23 years together, ended by a creature that shouldn't exist. We wrapped her body in blankets. I couldn't even take her outside, give her the dignity of a proper burial. The weight of her absence crushed me. I saw my son, Jacob, only 14, step up, taking care of his sister, organizing our dwindling supplies. I was proud and heartbroken all at once. The radio broadcasts grew less frequent. Reports came in of whole neighborhoods falling silent. Downtown Millbrook, overrun. The centipedes were getting bigger, stronger. One broadcaster described specimens reaching 6 feet in length at the water treatment facility, theorizing they were laying eggs in the sewer system. His broadcast cut off mid-sentence. Jacob stopped speaking after Sandra died. Emma's fever broke, but something in her eyes had changed. I held them close at night, telling them stories about before, promises about after, lies I told to keep us all sane. On the 8th day, someone pounded on our front door. Mr. Abernathy from down the street, clutching a shotgun in white-knuckled hands, begged to be let in. "They're right behind me," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "For God's sake, let me in." I heard the skittering before I saw them, dozens of centipedes flooding the street. Mr. Abernathy whirled around, firing twice. The shotgun blasts echoed through the empty neighborhood. 2 of the creatures burst open, but there were too many. For everyone that fell, 3 more surged forward. "Run!" I shouted from behind the door. "The basement of the church. It's reinforced." He turned to run, firing his last shell, but his foot caught on the curb. He went down hard. The gun clattered away. Before I could decide whether to risk opening the door, the street filled with centipedes. His screams echoed long after he disappeared from view. That night, we turned off the radio. The emergency broadcasts had stopped entirely. On the 9th day, we heard helicopters. Hope, a feeling I'd almost forgotten, surged through me. We carefully made our way upstairs and from our porch saw military helicopters hovering over the town center. Men in hazmat suits moved through the streets, spraying from large tanks. "We're saved," I whispered, tears in my eyes. A military broadcast confirmed my hopes. "Remain in your homes. Operation Eradication is underway. Industrial-grade insecticide is being deployed to eliminate the arthropod threat." My wife would have worried about the chemicals. She would have insisted we seal the vents. But I was tired, desperate. I decided the military knew what they were doing, though my conviction was weak. I just wanted it to be over. The following morning, the skittering had stopped. Silence fell over the house like a blanket. I ventured upstairs first. Centipedes lay curled and motionless throughout the house. Outside, they carpeted the lawn, the street. "It's over," I said, a smile breaking across my face for the first time in days. "We can go out." Emma started coughing first, then Jacob. I felt it too, a burning in my lungs, my eyes watering. I stumbled, falling to my knees as realization dawned. The insecticide, I gasped. It's still in the air. I tried to get the kids back to the basement, but it was too late. The chemical designed to stop the invasion was just as efficient at stopping human hearts. My last thought was of Sandra. Perhaps it was better this way. At least we would be together again. As my vision darkened, I saw military vehicles roll down our street, men in protective gear collecting samples of the creatures that had taken our town. And now, in a different way, our lives. We survived the monsters only to fall victim to the cure. In the end, I suppose it didn't matter. Millbrook was already a ghost town. I wonder if anyone will remember us, the last family of a town that no longer exists. The first time I heard it moving through my possessions, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. The second time, I blamed mice in the walls. By the third time, when that wet, gurgling chuckle echoed from somewhere deep within the labyrinth of my belongings, I knew something had come to live with me. Something that wasn't there before. Something that found the perfect hiding place in the fortress of forgotten treasures I'd built around myself. They call people like me hoarders, compulsive accumulators, health hazards. That's what the social worker who visited last month said, clipboard in hand, judgment in her eyes. But she's wrong. I'm a collector. Each object under my roof has a purpose, a memory, a potential future use that justifies its presence. The vintage toasters from the 70s might be worth something someday. The stacks of newspapers contain information I haven't yet processed. The 37 umbrellas? Well, umbrellas break easily, don't they? My home has developed its own geography over the years. Narrow footpaths wind between towering stacks of cardboard boxes. The kitchen long ago surrendered most of its counter space to appliances I've rescued from curbsides. My bedroom is a nest, carved out of the accumulated mass of my life. With just enough space for a twin mattress and a reading lamp clamped to a tower of hardcover books I've been meaning to read. The bathroom remains somewhat functional, though the bathtub has become a storage unit for holiday decorations I couldn't bear to throw away. I lived alone, or had done so for 12 years since Margaret left, taking only what could fit in her sedan. Choose between your things and me, she'd said. In retrospect, perhaps I'd made the wrong choice. But my things don't judge me. They don't demand that I change. They simply exist in silent partnership with me, filling the spaces that might otherwise feel too empty. Or at least, they used to be silent, until the sounds began. The first time, I dismissed it as house settling. Old homes make noises. This is a fact universally understood. The gentle rustling from inside a precarious mountain of shopping bags in the dining room was surely just air moving through the plastic. The soft scratching behind the wall of cardboard boxes blocking the guest bedroom doorway was probably mice. An unwelcome, but not unexpected visitor in a house like mine. But then came the night I heard something different. A soft, deliberate chuckle. I bolted upright in my bed, disturbing a pile of sweaters that had been slowly migrating from the foot of the mattress toward my sleeping form. The sound had been so distinct, a wet, gurgling noise that was unmistakably alive, unmistakably sentient. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. My voice bounced back to me, dampened by the cardboard fabric and plastic that surrounded me. "Is someone there?" Silence answered. Of course it did. I lived alone. I was certain I'd locked the doors. They were partially blocked by stacks of old encyclopedias anyway, making them difficult for even me to open. I convinced myself it had been part of a dream, and settled back into my nest of blankets and forgotten laundry. 3 days later, I noticed something had moved. I know how this sounds. In a house like mine, how could I possibly notice a single object out of place? but certain pathways were sacred. The route from bed to bathroom, bathroom to kitchen, kitchen to front door. These channels had to remain navigable. And there, in the middle of my kitchen pathway, sat a crystal candy dish I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't simply in the path, it was placed there, centered, deliberate, and inside it was a single butterscotch candy, still in its yellow wrapper. I hadn't purchased butterscotch candies since my mother died 5 years earlier. They had been her favorite. Stress, I muttered to myself as I returned the dish to a random shelf. I must have moved it myself and forgotten. But that night, the noises returned with greater insistence. No longer just rustling and scratching, but the distinct sound of objects being shifted. A soft thud as something fell. The clink of glass or ceramic. And again, that horrible wet chuckle closer now. So close it might have been at the foot of my bed. I lay paralyzed, eyes straining in the darkness. The mountains of possessions that had always brought me comfort now concealed something foreign, something unwelcome. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. A box of old Christmas cards tumbled from a nearby pile. I screamed, a sound so unfamiliar in this quiet house that it seemed to startle even the intruder. For several seconds, absolute silence fell. Then came a shuffling retreat, moving away from my bedroom, weaving through the labyrinth of my possessions. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake until dawn broke, casting gray light through the one window not completely obscured by my belongings. As soon as I felt brave enough, I followed the path to my kitchen, seeking the comfort of coffee and rationality. The candy dish was back in the middle of the floor. Now it held 3 butterscotch candies. Over the next week, I began to document the disturbances. Objects moved, food disappeared from the kitchen, not just packaged items, but half-eaten leftovers I'd intended to finish. Twice I found dirty smudges on my bathroom mirror, at a height that would reach my chest. They looked like handprints, but not human ones. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. I considered calling someone. The police? What would I tell them? That I suspected a tiny burglar was living inside the mess of my home, eating my food and moving my trinkets. Or perhaps Margaret. "You were right about the hoarding, dear. Now something lives in the piles and torments me at night." She'd have me committed. So I remained silent, watchful, increasingly sleepless. I began to hear the intruder's movements during daylight hours too, always just out of sight, always hidden behind some stack of treasure I couldn't bear to disturb. Until the night it decided to show itself. I had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around 3 a.m. when something cold touched my face. My eyes flew open to meet another pair of eyes, huge, reflective like a cat's, but round and unblinking. They hovered above me at about the height a child would stand beside my bed. But this was no child. In the dim light filtering through my single exposed window, I could make out a face like gnarled tree bark, with a nose that hooked sharply downward toward a wide, wet mouth. The creature was hairless, its skin a mottled gray-green that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the weak moonlight. Spindly limbs extended from a hunched torso that couldn't have stood more than 4 feet tall. It was perched on a stack of magazines beside my bed, perfectly balanced despite its awkward proportions. In one long-fingered hand it held a butterscotch candy, unwrapped and glistening with saliva. I tried to scream but produced only a wheezing gasp. The creature's mouth stretched wider, a smile, I realized with horror. "Collector," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping concrete. "You've made such a lovely home for me." I kicked frantically, tangling myself in blankets as I scrambled backward until my spine pressed against the headboard. The creature didn't advance, merely tilted its head with apparent curiosity. What are you?" I finally managed. "A guest," it replied, rolling the candy across its palm. "An appreciative guest. Your treasures are my forest, your pathways, my tunnels." It gestured expansively at the surrounding chaos. So many places to hide. So many things to play with. "Get out," I whispered. "Get out of my house." The creature's smile dimmed. "But you invited me." Every box, every bag, every precious thing you couldn't part with. They're all little invitations, little welcomes. It popped the candy into its mouth with a wet smack. We're symbiotic, you and I. You build the labyrinth, I inhabit it. I'll clean, I threatened weakly. I'll throw everything away. The creature laughed, that same horrible chuckle I'd been hearing for weeks. No, you won't. You can't. These things are your skin now. Peel them away and you'll bleed. With that, it leapt from the stack of magazines to the floor with surprising agility. I caught a glimpse of it scurrying on all fours before it disappeared into a tunnel-like opening between two towers of storage bins. I didn't sleep again that night, or the next. I made feeble attempts at clearing some pathways, but the creature was right. Each object I considered discarding suddenly seemed vitally important, irreplaceable. My hands shook. My chest tightened. I couldn't do it. The creature grew bolder. I'd catch glimpses of it during daylight now. A flash of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow where no shadow should be. It left me gifts, strange arrangements of my own possessions, tiny towers of matchbooks balanced on thumbtacks, necklaces tied into complex knots. Last night, exhausted beyond reason, I finally fell into a deep sleep. I dreamed of swimming through my possessions as if they were water, searching for something I'd lost but couldn't name. I woke to find the creature sitting on my chest. Its weight was surprisingly heavy for something so small, pressing the air from my lungs. Those huge eyes stared into mine from inches away. Its breath smelled of butterscotch and rot. "Collector," it whispered, running one long finger down my cheek. "I've been thinking about our arrangement." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "You've been so generous, sharing your treasures, your food, your space." Its finger traced down to my throat, then to my chest, where it began tapping a rhythm against my sternum. "But I want more. I want to share everything." "Please," I gasped, the pressure in my chest building to an unbearable level. "Please, don't." "I could live inside you," it mused, leaning closer until its face filled my entire field of vision. "Your ribs could be my shelves, your organs, my treasures to arrange." The pain began then, a crushing, vice-like sensation that radiated from my chest down my left arm. My vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. The creature noticed the change in me and tilted its head again, curious but not concerned. "Your heart makes such interesting sounds," it remarked, pressing its ear against my chest. "Like footsteps running down an empty hallway, getting faster and faster." I tried to cry out, but my voice failed me. The pressure had become an inferno, consuming me from the inside. The last thing I saw as consciousness faded was the creature's wide, wet smile and its gleaming eyes, watching with academic interest as my life became one more thing it collected from my cluttered home. I think I'm dying. And as darkness takes me, my final thought is horribly, perfectly clear. I've spent my life making a perfect habitat for a monster, building my own tomb one saved object at a time.